Disinformation never stops, and neither do we. Welcome to StopFake, the place where we set the record straight on fakes about Ukraine. I'm Christi Hofland, and this week we dissect the following fakes. Russian language in the worst possible situation ever in Ukraine. Is Ukraine really the most anti-Semitic post-Soviet state? HIV and AIDS from Donbas sweeping across Ukraine. So, let's get to it. Russian propagandist site Ukraina.ru published an article this week declaring that the Russian language was in the worst possible situation ever in Ukraine. The source for this claim was a Ukrainian internet newspaper Europejska Pravda interview with the director and secretary of the Venice Commission, Thomas Marquette. In the interview, Marquette said Ukraine's new education law treats EU and non-EU languages differently, and as a result, Russian has found itself in a worse position. Ukraina.ru also falsely claimed that from now on teaching would be done only in Ukrainian and that Ukraine was obliged to carry out all Venice Commission recommendations. The Venice Commission is a Council of Europe advisory body made up of independent constitutional law experts. Commission opinions are only recommendations and not obligatory. According to Ukraine's State Statistics Services, which tracks social and economic data, Ukraine has 581 Russian language schools with 356,000 students. These are the largest numbers for any minority language school in Ukraine. In a recent opinion piece, Ukrainian Foreign Minister and ethnic Russian Pavlo Klimkin reassured that the Russian language is not facing any threats in Ukraine. Just like in the USSR, Russia is heard on the streets of large cities. It's omnipresent on Ukrainian television and dominates printed media. Klimkin pointed out that it is high time for the international community to understand the complex language situation that is the result of centuries of Russian rule in Ukraine. Russian publications such as RIA Novosti, Ukraina.ru, Moskovsky Komsomolets, and others disseminated a story claiming that Ukraine has become the most anti-Semitic country in the post-Soviet space. The source of this information purports to be the 2017 Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs Anti-Semitism report. On January 21, a few days before Holocaust Remembrance Day, Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Naftali Bennett, presented the annual Report on Anti-Semitic Trends and Incidents for 2017. Focusing on countries where Jews live, the report presents Ukraine in a singularly negative light. The report claims that the number of anti-Semitic incidents has doubled in Ukraine and that Ukraine has the largest number of anti-Semitic incidents of any post-Soviet country. While Russian media are busy twisting the Israeli report, it is worth noting that the report itself raises many questions. The report should be viewed with skepticism, writes Israeli newspaper Haaretz. According to correspondent Ofer Aderet, it is thin on methodology and data, far from a scientific report, and appears to be a public relations tool aimed to justify the existence of the diaspora ministry. Vyacheslav Likhachov, who heads the Ukrainian National Minority Rights Monitoring Group, has been systematically monitoring anti-Semitism and xenophobia in Ukraine for over 10 years. He says the report is written from a stereotypical view and does not take into account Ukraine's real historical and political context. Likhachov notes that the authors of the Israeli report appear to have simply looked on the internet and prepared a report filled with stereotypical generalizations. He suspects that the report's authors dumped together all incidents that they heard about without differentiating real acts of anti-Semitism from insults shouted during a march. This breaches all standards used by professional monitoring groups for documenting hate crimes. Had the authors of the Israeli Ministry report followed the systematic monitoring available, said Likhachov, they would have found that, on the whole, minority rights monitors record a positive downward trend of anti-Semitic instances in Ukraine. Scores of Russian and Ukrainian media featured stories last month claiming the war in the eastern Ukrainian Donbas region was causing a huge spike in AIDS. The source for these inaccurate claims, an article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, states that there is a redistribution of existing HIV infections in Ukraine. It does not claim that there is any new outbreak of HIV infections. Russia's Lenta.ru set the fakes in motion by featuring some accurate quotes from the American academic article and combining them with erroneous conclusions and other contrived facts. Other Russian sites simply followed suit. The American scientific article is titled "Molecular Epidemiology Reveals the Role of War in the Spread of HIV in Ukraine." It examines the movement of HIV-positive persons from the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine to the rest of the country, thus raising the number of HIV infections in those regions. The article points out that the spike in the number of infection is proportionate to the number of registered internally displaced persons from the east. The article's analysis reflects the redistribution of existing infections, with Donetsk and Luhansk being significant exporters of the virus in the rest of the country. These cities are not controlled by the Ukrainian government. Ukraine's health ministry, Community Health Center, refutes the Russian media spin on this article. According to UN AIDS analysis of HIV prevention and AIDS treatment in conditions of conflict in eastern Ukraine, the war has destroyed the care infrastructure and impacted the quality and quantity of services available in the war zone. This compels HIV-infected people to move to Ukrainian-controlled territory. The center predicts that the rates of HIV infection in Ukraine will decline over the next 4 years, and the estimated number of deaths from AIDS will be cut in half. The highest level of HIV infections were registered in Odessa, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Kyiv, and Chernihiv regions, areas where many displaced persons have settled. According to UNAIDS data, in 2016, Ukraine had 17,000 new HIV infections, 240,000 people were living with HIV, AIDS, and nearly 40% of them were taking antiretroviral drugs. That's all we have time for this week. There are more dissected fakes on our website, StopFake.com, so please give us a click. Be vigilant, respect your mind, and don't consume fakes. If you spot any disinformation about Ukraine, send it to us for a truth autopsy. I'm Christi Hofland, and this is StopFake. Thanks for watching.